Anything a doctor doesn't understand he calls hysteria, put in Breely. I consider these specialists nuisances. Well, anyhow, our Amateur Spook Spotter Association seems to have come to an ultimate end, said I regretfully. Of the original number, only Breely remains. Wouldn't our deserters be chagrined if we should now proceed to enjoy a really startling session? We will, Mrs. Smiley responded. I feel the power all about me. Good, cried Fowler. This is the way you should feel. If you are at ease, the spirits will do the rest. Sit back and rest, I said. We have plenty of time. You've been too anxious, don't worry. In the meanwhile, between the sitting at Miller's house and this present one, I had been reading much on the subject of the trance and of the externalization of the fluidic double, of which the continental philosophers have much to say. If not convinced, I was at least under conviction that the liberations of the astral self was possible, if at all, only in the deepest trance. And I now attempted to discover by interrogation of Mrs. Smiley's precisely what her own conception of the process was. You told me once that you are conscious of leaving your body when in trance, I said. Do you always have that sensation? I almost always have a feeling of floating in the air, she answered. It often seems as if I had risen a few feet above and a little to one side of my material self, to which I am somehow attached. I can see my body and what goes on around it, and yet somehow it all seems kind of dim, like a dream. It's hard to tell you just what I mean, but I seem to be in both places at once. Do you ever have any perception of a physical connection between yourself and the sitters? She seemed to me to answer this a bit reluctantly. Yes, I sometimes feel as though little shining threads went out from me and those in the circle, and sometimes these threads meet and twine themselves around the cone or the pencil. This means that I draw power from all my sitters. This was in accord with the accounts of a cobwebby feeling which both Maxwell and Flammarion had drawn from their mediums. Maxwell makes much of this curious physical sensation which accompanied certain of Maurice's phenomena. Here also seemed to be an unconscious corroboration of Albert de Rocha's experiments in the externalization of motivity, as he calls it, the cobwebby feeling of the fingers that might mean an actual raying out of some subtle form of matter. Indeed, M. Maurice, Maxwell's mediums, declared he could see a sheath of filaments pass from his fingers to the objects of experimentation. Tell us about your journeys into the spirit land, I suggested. You sometimes seem to go far away, do you not? Her voice became very wistful as she compiled. Yes, sometimes I seem to go to a far-off, bright world. I don't always want to come back, but there is a little shining white ribbon that unites my spirit with my body and holds me fast. Once when I had resolved never to return, that little band of light began to tug at me, and, although it broke my heart to leave my children, who were there with me, I yielded and came back to life. It was very cheerful and lovely in that land, and I hated to come back to the cold and cruel earth plane. Can't you tell us about it more particularly? No, it is so different from this plane that I have no words in which to describe it, and all I can say is that it seems glorious and happy and very light. Something in her gentle accent excited Fowler's sympathy. Mrs. Smiley, you have the blood of the martyrs in you. It takes courage to put oneself into the hands of the cold-blooded scientists like Miller. Even Garland here has no pity. He's like a hound on a trail of a fawn. It's all material for him. Now, I'm nothing but a mild-mannered editor. I have all the facts I require concerning the spirit world. I'm busied with trying to make people happy here on this earth. But these scientific sharps are avid for any fact which sustains the particular theory that happens to hold. Not 1 in 100 will go where the facts lead. This investigation is all a process of self-glorification, wherein each one thinks he must prove all the others liars or weak-minded in order to exalt himself. To this I could only reply, I'm not a scientist, though I must say I sympathize with the scientific method. And as for my treatment of Mrs. Smiley, I am following exactly the advice of her controls. They assure me that they will take care of her. And so they will, responded the devoted little psychic. By the closest questioning, I had never been able to change a single line of her simple faith. She was perfectly certain of the spirit world. She had daily messages from Wilbur and her spirit father, partly by voices, but mainly by intuition. Her children hovered over her while she slept. Mitchell healed her if she were ill. Maudie comforted her loneliest hours. These voices, these hands, were an integral part of her world, as necessary and as dear to her as those of her friends in the flesh. As she talked on, I experienced a keen pang of regret. Why disturb her belief in the spirit world, I asked myself. Why attempt to reduce her manifestations to natural magic? To rob her of her convictions that Maudie is able to come back to her world, leave her poor indeed. However, as the scientist cannot permit pity to hinder his purpose, I was determined to disassociate the facts of spiritualism from the cult of spiritualism. I was not concerned with faith or consolidation. I returned to a study of the facts as a part of nature. I was now observing closely the 3 levels of sleep into which Mrs. Smiley seemed to lower herself at will, or upon the suggestion of those in the circle. I'd adopted the theory that in the lighter trance she spoke unconsciously and wrote automatically. In the second and deeper trance she became the somnambulist, possessed of diabolical cleverness. When the higher senses in abeyance, she was able to deceive and to elude all detection. In the third or death-like trance, I was ready to admit, for the sake of argument, that she was able to see, as de Rochas and Maxwell seemed to have demonstrated, to exert an unknown form of force beyond the peripheral of the body, that is to say, to move objects at a distance and to produce voices from the horn.